And if gold takes center stage as the monetary king, as it should be, silver will go along for the ride. And there's an argument to be made that neither of them will ever come back down.
Hey everyone, this is Elijah K. Johnson with the Miles Franklin Market Update. With us today is our president, Andy Schectman, for our weekly chat. Andy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to see you, Elijah. Good to be back, and glad we're doing these weekly discussions. They're really awesome, and I appreciate your efforts.
Well, it's great to have you, Andy. And the first topic I'd like to discuss is about the Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, the IMF just put out this announcement that there should be this new Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, to understand what that means, we need to kind of back up and say, what was the original Bretton Woods Agreement about? So can you give us some insight about that? And then why is this new Bretton Woods Agreement announcement that we need this new Bretton Woods Agreement? Why is that so important?
Well, first of all, Bretton Woods is in New Hampshire. It was the post-World War II meeting of the Allied nations who all agreed to have their currencies fixed in relation to the U.S. dollar, which would be anointed the world reserve currency, taking over for the pound sterling, which was the world reserve currency prior to the U.S. dollar. And so, I've been talking a lot, Elijah, about Bretton Woods for the last year, and it's really dominated what I've talked about. In fact, sometimes I think I've beaten it into the ground, but it bears mentioning and bears mentioning again. What came out of Bretton Woods were several things, including the International Monetary Fund and the classification of the U.S. Treasury as the only Tier 1 asset in the world. And if your listeners were to Google Tier 1 assets, they would see a riskless asset as defined by the central banks. So literally since 1944, since that weekend in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the U.S. Treasury market has had the benefit of being the world's singular Tier 1 asset. And I guess you could argue that a dollar, an account that was segregated would be Tier 1 asset also. As an example, if someone needed collateral, an escrowed account in dollars, or if a central bank needed collateral, an escrowed account in dollars would also be Tier 1. But by and large, when banks, central and commercial, would trade with one another over the last nearly 80 years, typically the only Tier 1 asset, the only collateral, the only riskless collateral as defined by these banks that was ever used was United States Treasuries. So if we go back to April of 2019, we see the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bank reclassifying gold as the only other Tier 1 asset in the world. And we've seen how the central banks have been voraciously accumulating it. And now, as you mentioned, we see last week the International Monetary Fund, 190 countries plus from around the world, that was born out of the Bretton Woods Agreement, saying we need a new Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, they were somewhat cryptic in what they were saying, but when we take a step back and realize that 2 years earlier, we saw the Bank of International Settlements reclassify gold. And when we take a step back even further, we see nations around the world, Germany, the Bank of Hungary, of Poland, the Dutch National Bank, all of these countries over the last several years have been repatriating their gold. And many of them have made announcements along the way that their drop-dead deadline for repatriation was 2020. A lot of things are fitting into place, Elijah, from the repatriation of gold by the world's central banks home, away from New York, away from London, away from Paris, the reclassification of it as a Tier 1 asset, and now the International Monetary Fund, made up of largely a lot of these countries that are asking for their gold back, are saying we want a new Bretton Woods. What does that mean? Does it mean gold will play center stage? I believe it will. I believe gold has a prominent role in what is coming next. You don't see institutions of this magnitude, of this size, making these kinds of declarations, going to these types of efforts to bring stuff home, repatriating gold that had been safely stored in the banks, supposedly anyway, of the New York Federal Reserve for the past 70 plus years. So it's a changing world all of a sudden, and that's really really capped, or an exclamation point alongside the IMF's request for a new Bretton Woods. So yes, I think we are on the cusp of a new system. Absolutely.
In this announcement that the IMF put out about this need for a new Bretton Woods, there was no explicit mention of gold. I'll put the link in the description of this video if people want to check out that announcement. But yeah, what is your perspective? Do you think gold will play a role in a new monetary system?
I do, wholeheartedly. I think that's what I'm getting at. So let's recap. You got reclassification. You have all the central banks bringing it home to have it to remove counterparty risk, to have it under their own thumb. You have the IMF requesting it. You take a look at what's happening on the COMEX market, Elijah, and it somewhat resembles the same thing. You have this group of reportables on the COMEX called others. So it used to be the commercial banks would fight the hedge funds, or the funds, as they were called. They would battle against each other, and there was always this third grouping of reportables called others, and they were always cryptic. They trade on the Globex, which is reserved for the wealthiest people in the world, and anonymity is strong in that market. But the bottom line is these others, we'll call them high net worth individuals, we'll call them family offices, we'll call them sovereign wealth funds, have stood for delivery in massive quantities, huge quantities over the last several delivery months. If they continue to do this, they will win. They will bankrupt the COMEX, or force a force majeure, or force the hand of the COMEX to change policy. But as it stands right now, you have high net worth individuals, people in the know, that we don't know who they are, but let's call them sovereign wealth funds and family offices, that are taking tremendous amounts of gold off the exchange in conjunction with all of the moves that we're seeing by the central banks, reclassifying, bringing it home. It's a trend that we are seeing, removing counterparty risk, all centered around gold. And if we look at the reclassification of gold in 2019, if we look a year before that, long before that move was ever identified, for 4 years preceding that, we see the central banks in a rush to bring their gold home, away from New York. And then we see the central banks massively accumulating gold in 2018. The Western central banks bought more gold in 2018 than they did in the 60 years previously combined, and up 90% in 2019 when they made that announcement. Put the pieces together. And the one common denominator in all of this, aside from removal of counterparty risk and taking possession of gold, is the absence of information from the mainstream. But the elite leave crumbs. They leave a trail. Why? So they can say, well, we told you. Weren't you listening? We told you. Go back and look. You can see we reclassified gold, but the thing of it is no one talks about it. Financial advisors I've known my whole life who are running books of massive, massive amounts of money have no clue about this. And every time I talk to someone in the mainstream, they're blown away by this. And so the point of it is that the lack of information is disturbing, but telling to me. Telling in the respect that the big money never wants to telegraph their move. They'll tell just enough to give themselves an alibi so they don't get accused of screwing the world. But by the same token, the information is not transparent, and you have to dig. You have to dig real hard. But when you put it all together, Elijah, when you put it all together, you see the most powerful, influential people in the world who are looking at gold in a vastly different light. You see them all pulling it home and putting it under their own care. And now you're seeing calls for a new Bretton Woods, which in and of itself says what we have known as a world reserve standard since 1944 is most likely on the cusps of changing. And that I do believe. And I do think gold will be the common denominator in all of this. I really do. You know, you look at what Russia has done. One of Putin's senior advisors recently said that the ruble is the most gold-backed currency in the world. You have the Chinese who, by most people's estimation, have accumulated 10 or 20 or 30 times more gold than they tell the world they have. They produce more gold than anyone in the world, and they don't sell hardly an ounce. They are voraciously accumulating it from around the world, and maybe next to India. Between the two of them, they go back and forth for #1 accumulators. in the world. You have all of the BRICS nations who have, over the last several years, Brazil and Russia and South Africa and India and China, they're all saying we want to lessen the dollar's dominance or hegemony in the world, and we think that it's not fair. If I had to guess, you'll see two systems emerge, one from the East and one from the West. And the only way that the populace of the world, whether it be East or West, drink that Kool-Aid is have it tied to something like gold. And, I guess the bottom line here is that all of the signs, you ever heard of the term Occam's razor? The most logical explanation prevails. All of the signs, to me, point to gold most certainly having a central figure role in what comes next, in the new system, in the new Bretton Woods. And I look at it most likely as possibly a two-tier system, East and West. But for sure, Elijah, as I've been saying a lot lately, the dollar bills that we call money, they'll be hanging from a frame in the Smithsonian real soon. I think sooner than most of us are prepared for. That's for sure.
And it's interesting because if you look back, about 40 years or so, when we completely went off of the gold standard, it's only been 40 years. 40 years is a blink of an eye compared to how long gold has been money, pretty much all of human history, 6,000 years. So if people are saying, we've moved beyond gold and all that stuff, no. Gold is money. That's what money is, and it's going to play a role in the future, and that's just the way money is.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned 40 years. I was speaking at the Sprott conference 2 years ago. I've touched on this a little bit lately also, but and I showed a slide that I think got a lot of attention and a lot of buzz by the attendees there. A lot of people requested me to send them a copy of that slide. I have a client and a friend who is a very, very wealthy gentleman, very successful in business, and is a depositor of J.P. Morgan Private Wealth. J.P. Morgan Private Wealth is the division of that bank that works with the wealthiest people in the world, the centimillionaires and the billionaires. And he sent me a letter 2 springs ago now, and the letter basically showed a chart going back to the 1400s. To all of the world's reserve currencies, the one common denominator, most of them lasted about 40 years. That was typically the extent of time before a new system took hold, somewhere in that neighborhood. And the letter, after showing that chart, said to the depositors, we want you to mitigate your exposure to the US dollar because we believe it will be challenged for singular world reserve currency status. Singular world reserve currency status. Here's your two-tier system. The BRICS nations, the U.S. new system, which I think is coming. But the bottom line is you have the wealthiest people in North America being told to mitigate exposure to the dollar because the most powerful commercial bank on the planet believes it will be challenged for world reserve status, showing throughout 600 years of history how world reserve currencies come and go, and the typical time frame is somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 years. But yeah, you get to a point where, the old saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Well, how about fool me 25 times? Go back throughout all of history. And unless you have some sort of tether, politicians will choose the road of inflation, always, and they will debase and destroy their currency, always. And the only way that you can remove that is to have it tied to gold. And if you look what's happened to the U.S. dollar since 1971, over that 40-plus year period, almost 50 now, what you see is a currency that's lost, 85, 90+%, maybe more, of its value since 1971. Once you give the politicians the ability, unfettered ability, to print, it's game over. And I think the world is tired of this cycle, this wash, rinse, and repeat. They're tired of being told by the Federal Reserve, well, 2% inflation is what we're striving for. But why? What that tells you, 2% inflation, the rule of 70 seconds divided into 72 tells you how long before your principal doubles. Well, that tells you with 2% inflation, every 36 years, your currency is halved. So, we've already almost halved and halved again. The point of it is, Elijah, is that I think in order to gain credibility, it has to be tied to something, and nothing has the historical significance world over as gold. because, as you said, it's been used as money for 6,000 years. We don't need to convince someone, well, let's use Bitcoin, or let's use a special drawing rights, or whatever it is that we want to tether this new currency to. None of it would hold a candle to the effect of gold. Now, here's where the digital currency comes into play. We could talk about a digital currency and the ramifications it may have on inflation, but to me, the utility of the digital currency, as far as that is concerned, in terms of letting the public know, hey, we're not going to screw you again, is by having the distributed ledger show the immutability or the veracity of the gold held on the ledger. Now, who's going to audit it? That's another question that hasn't been answered yet. But the bottom line is that if we can show via a distributed ledger that the gold exists and that it is truly underpinning a new currency, it'll give it a far more credible base from which to grow. Short of that, everything else is just fiat. And that has proven to be a recipe for continued and repetitive debasement and ultimately destruction of the system. Every paper currency ultimately returns to its inherent value, piece of paper, basically worthless. As Franz Pick once said, all currencies are inherently meant to die. And I think that's why this experiment, which has been conducted now for the better part of 600 years with several world reserve currencies, it's coming to an end quickly. And something new will take its place, but we will go full circle. We will go back to some sort of a tether. Now, it's important to mention one thing. The last time we were on a gold standard, Elijah, you could go into a bank with a $20 gold coin, or excuse me, a $20 Federal Reserve, no, let me take that back, a $20 Treasury note that said, instead of saying, "In God We Trust," it said, "Payable to the bearer on demand in gold coin." You could take that into the bank, and you could get back a $20 gold piece. That was a convertible, redeemable, one-to-one fashion of backing. I don't think we'll see that again. But what I do think we'll see is some sort of a percentage, maybe 10 or 15 or 20% of a new dollar or a new BRICS nation's currency that will be tethered to gold. It won't be redeemable. You won't go into Bank of America with $100 and get $100 worth of gold. But what you will have is the assurance from the government that the currency is indeed tethered, and that allows the government to no longer destroy the currency unfettered. It will put a governor on their ability to print. So the fact that I don't believe it will be redeemable isn't the issue. The issue is, what can we do to keep the governments from continuing to debase? I mean, look at it this way. We've created $4 trillion on a deficit this year. $4 trillion. It took this country 300 years to create $800 billion in wealth. $4 trillion where the national debt is rising by about $600,000 a minute. It's ridiculous. So the bottom line is we have to do something different in order to A, save the system, and B, gain credibility if we want to move forward. So yes, I do think gold will play central stage in whatever comes next.
Now, what is your perspective on, will silver play a role? Because throughout history, silver has actually been used as money more than gold, a lot of people point out. So what is your perspective on that?
That's very true. Silver has been used as money much more than gold. I mean, let's talk about silver for a minute. It's very unique. It has very unique properties. It's the only, to my knowledge, the only commodity that is heavily industrial, but also, as you mentioned, has a rich 6,000-year monetary history. You know, you look at something like copper. Well, copper is pretty much only industrial. And you look at gold, and it has very few industrial qualities. It is used a little bit in industry, but mostly it's monetary, investment. Silver, on the other hand, is both. And I think that first, when we talk about previous bull markets, last 5 bull markets in precious metals, gold has always gone first. Silver always goes further after. Gold goes first, silver flies up and catches up and outperforms in terms of percentage. If we follow this pattern, first, you could see that happening, and we have. We saw in July how powerful silver can be when it moved up $10 in just a couple of weeks. But if we were to see that happen, where gold started to take off because of an underpinning of a world reserve, when people began to realize that, and the funds like the Ohio Police and Fire, like Warren Buffett, all of these big hedge funds that are dipping a toe in the water, just small percentages, but large dollar amounts, 800 million with Ohio Police and Fire, which was 5% of their fund, or 2.5% of Berkshire Hathaway, which amounts to a rounding error. These are all just little toe dips in the water. When the realization comes that big money needs to make a shift and gold starts to take off, and then it is reclassified as a new underpinning to a world reserve currency, it'll be too expensive for everyone else. Silver will then gain recognition, and it will gain recognition quickly. People will remember, it is a monetary metal, we better get it. The populace, the investment demand will all of a sudden swarm into silver. It'll overwhelm the silver market, and this is when the industrial side kicks in. The Apple, who makes iPhones, needs it to make an iPhone. Textiles, they need it. Solar panels. Right now, solar panels amount for somewhere in the neighborhood of 40, 50, 60% of all the silver mined every year for solar panels. Now there's a law in California that says all new construction needs solar. And I want to say if, I'm not saying I want Joe Biden to win, but if Joe Biden wins, you will see a massive push, I think, in industrial silver, as he has made it very clear he wants to move away from fossil fuels and he wants a green form of energy, and that is solar. And the proliferation of solar across the United States in and of itself could force all of these industrials to secure their silver for the future, and bam, then it goes up. So you have a industrial and investment clashing and fighting for what is available. You had the U.S. government a few years ago come out and say silver will be the first element struck from the periodic table of elements due to the fact that it is a depleting asset. You have Keith Neumeyer saying that what comes out of the ground right now is 6-to-1, and the ratio is closer to 80-to-1. Silver is stupidly undervalued, but it will not be part of a new world reserve system. It just, A, that there's not enough of it, and B, its industrial uses are too important for it to be held in a vault somewhere underpinning a currency. But the relationship of gold to silver, of 6,000 years of them having a 90% correlation in movement, will bring silver along for the ride. And when gold becomes far too expensive for most people, silver will become an alternative to gold. I mean, it already is an alternative to gold. It just takes 80 ounces or so to buy 1 ounce of gold. Remember what Keith Neumeyer is saying, 6 is coming out of the ground. Geologically, for thousands of years, it was 15.5-to-1. We're so far out of whack. Silver is what everyone should be accumulating right now. It won't be part of a new world reserve system, but it will be brought along for the ride. And I think both from the monetary side and maybe giving it the turbo power, the really supercharging its upside, where people talk $600-700 silver. That's when the industrials say, I don't care, get as much as you can buy, because if we don't have it, we can't make what we need. So that's what's unusual about silver, is that it has both industrial and monetary history. And if gold takes center stage as the monetary king, as it should be, silver will go along for the ride. And there's an argument to be made that neither of them will ever come back down. So, I think silver's the play right now, Elijah, but not part of the new system.
Well, Andy Schectman, thank you so much for joining us today. Before we let you go, did you want to share with the viewers any last thoughts you had?
Well, it's going to be a couple of crazy weeks ahead, Elijah. I think that securing your position in metals now before the election is very important. We have a very, very nice supply. And whether you believe Trump wins or Biden wins is irrelevant. I think mitigating our exposure to the U.S. dollar in the wake of the IMF announcement, in the wake of reclassification of gold, in the wake of all of the things that are pointing to systems changing globally, not just here, but across the globe, I think people need to mitigate their exposure to the system. I really do believe they need to mitigate their exposure to the dollar, because what we are seeing right now is unprecedented. We are seeing governments around the world rapidly destroy their currencies. And to keep all of your wealth in dollars and dollar-based assets is a massive mistake. The question should not be how much gold and silver should we own. The question should be, what exposure do we want to a currency that is historically, according to what we've talked about today, according to many, many other examples and history, is at the end of its road. So I would say with objectivity and with sincerity, I hope people will listen to what I'm saying. I believe it to be the truth in my heart and in my soul, and that's why I've accumulated it every 2 weeks for the last 30 years, and I'll continue to do so. So I appreciate you helping bring these types of topics to the public, and I appreciate your support of Miles Franklin and all that you're doing. So until next week, Elijah, I hope you have a great weekend. I'll look forward to seeing what the world has in store for us next week, Friday.
Definitely have a great weekend. And yeah, if our viewers are interested in calling us, they can call us at 1-800-822-8080 or email us at info@milesfranklin.com. Andy, thank you and God bless.
God bless, Elijah. Look forward to seeing you next week.